Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking today about social media and tech use in teens and tweens. And we'll be talking about some research and some tools for helping teens start to use their tech in adaptive ways that are going to benefit them.
So we'll just start off by introducing ourselves just so that you know who we are. I've done a couple of lunch and learns this term already, so you might recognize me, but my name's Laura. I'm a psychology practicum student here at the Waterloo Board, and I'm currently doing my PhD in school and applied child psychology at Western. And this is a topic of particular interest for both Selena and I because both of our doctoral research focuses on broadly the relationship between tech use and mental health in teens. So that's me, and Selena, I'll let you.
Yeah, so I am also a practicum student here at the board, and I go to the University of Waterloo, and I'm in my third year of my PhD. And as Laura said, my work kind of broadly focuses on teens' communication on social media and their own characteristics that influence how they interact. So before we get started, we'll leave some time at the end for questions. If you have any questions, please just write them in the chat or unmute your chat button if you feel comfortable. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, please put your email in the chat, and then there will also be a video recording available. And if you have any feedback about the presentation, we would love to hear it. So please let us know, and there's a link to leave feedback anonymously.
And we'll include the link at the end for you guys as well, just in case you don't grab it here. But yes, as Selena said, we'd appreciate any things you enjoyed, things you'd like to hear more about, things you'd like to hear less about, things like that. So we'll kind of get into the meat of our presentation, and I always like to start off by talking about, why talk about this, why is it important for you? Probably if you're attending this presentation, you've got probably a young person in mind whose screen use you've got questions about or concerns about. And I think this issue of screen time is unarguably one of the most, if not the most, hot button issues in terms of teens and mental health today. And this really applies not just for teens, but for everyone. Over the course of our lives, we've all experienced together this rapid period of technological advancement that has fundamentally changed the way we talk to other people, consume media, receive the news, do our work, go to school. I always like to share this graphic that shows, when the Apple iPhone 4 came out, which I believe was in 2010, that it had already at that point about 4 times as much processing power as the Mars rover. Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about, all of this power and information that we've suddenly had access to in our pockets. And this has definitely become even more of an issue since the COVID pandemic started. Our entire lives moved online. We learn lots of new ways to leverage technology that have persisted, even now as the pandemic is still an influence, but perhaps less of a pressing influence in our day-to-day lives as it once was. And of course, this shift has led parents and all people really to have lots of questions about the impacts of tech use on, mental health, growth and development, physical health, emotional health. As we see tech kind of permeating every aspect of our lives, wondering what sort of impact this has on us and how we should manage that. And so, as we consider these questions and the role of technology in ours and our kids' lives, there are lots of new challenges and responsibilities that parents are navigating. And I think that what Selena and I would like to do today is talk a little bit more about how those challenges and responsibilities can be turned into opportunities, how you can find ways for tech to serve an adaptive role in the lives of your kids.
So what do we actually know about screen time? We know that tech plays a central role in teens' life, with almost 97% of Canadian youth reporting that they have personal access to a cell phone. Cell phones have become a lot more accessible. And how are teens actually using their time online? So we know that teens have activities of choice. They're mostly watching videos online, so through YouTube and TikTok. And what's popular online changes so often, it can often feel really hard to keep up as a parent, as an educator, as researchers ourselves. And the relationship between screen time and mental health is still unclear. There's a lot of mixed findings in the literature, with some finding a lot of benefits, some finding some negative consequences. But what we do know from the literature is that for adolescents and teens, how they are using their screens is a lot more predictive of their mental health than how much they're using. So when teens are using screens and tech to connect with friends and family, research has actually found that it can enhance offline relationships and things like self-esteem. But when tech is used in harmful ways, like constantly comparing yourself to influencers or, sharing explicit images that can have legal consequences, these are kind of the extreme examples that are linked to increased risks online and challenges with mental health.
We also know we have a little bit more information these days in terms of screen time, knowing that it's not all equal. So, as Selena said, it's become, we understand now that it's much less about how much youth are using their phones and more about just how they're using your phones. So one thing to consider or have in the back of your mind as we move through this presentation is that there are lots of different types of screen time. And this is, just one way to think about it. There's time that's necessary. So time for school or work, time that we have to be on our email, Google Classroom, looking at notes. There's time that connects us with others. So things like, video chats, connecting with friends or family, interacting with people on social media. And then there's time for leisure, enjoyment, or relaxation. So doing things like playing games, watching TV, watching movies, watching YouTube videos. So I would encourage you as we move through this presentation, I'm sure that you have a young person in your life in mind. What types of screen time are they engaging in? What types are you concerned about? What might you be less concerned about? There are also different types of screen use. So you certainly have your more age typical teen, of course, spending probably what feels like every waking minute on their screens, but tech and screens are probably not interfering with going to school, getting homework done, going to extracurriculars, things like that. And I always like to share as a bit of a grounding point that the current average for teens in terms of the amount of time that they're spending on screens per day is about 8 hours. So that of course includes things like passive watching of TV, time where they're at school using screens, time on their phone. But, just for context, in terms of the current average, that does sit about 8 hours per day in terms of what's typical for an adolescent right now. And there can certainly be more problematic use as well, when tech use or screens start to interfere with more important parts of youth's lives. Maybe they're starting to have really big reactions when screens are removed or aggression. We don't have as much space in this presentation today to talk about those more problematic aspects of screen use, but we've got some resources that we'll talk a bit more about the end that you can have a look at if that's something that you're experiencing and are concerned about. Another way that screen use has been conceptualized is in terms of active versus passive use. So active use being those times, when you're engaging cognitively or physically with tech. I think about kids doing things like building villages on Minecraft or making their own content or videos, chatting with friends back and forth, versus more passive consumption, like simply watching a TV show or those times when you're sort of scrolling through your feed without really actively engaging in what you're looking at. I think there are certainly times where we are scrolling and engaging with things that we're looking at, but times when we aren't too. And so again, when you think about, the young person in your life that you have in mind, are they more of an active versus a passive user? Are you concerned about one or more of the other? Does their screen use fit in terms of this like age typical amount of time? Just some things to think about.
So now that we've talked a little bit about screen time versus screen use, what do you actually do with this information and how do you help your teen? And so we want to make a note that these are really just suggestions and not every tool we're going to talk about is going to work for your family, and it might take some experimentation to kind of figure out what works best. Screens are here to stay, and so it's never too late to start encouraging your teens to use their tech to their advantage and in more adaptive ways. And when you're implementing any new tech tools or limits around screen use, it is very common for teens to kind of push back against that. Not just with tech, with lots of things, but they really just want to see, if you're serious about these new limits and if you're going to follow the rules yourself as a parent. And so we wanted to start talking a little bit about self-compassion as a parent. We live in a world where our brains and the world make it really easy to be self-critical. And we can often be our own worst critics, and we talk to ourselves a lot more harshly than we would talk to like loved ones or friends or family. And there's a lot of pressure on parents to be on top of kids' screen use at all times and limit the amount of time spent online. And there's a lot of information coming at parents about how much kids should be online. And it can feel like a constant battle to try and stay on top of. And so we just wanted to kind of put something in here about how, parents are human. And if you need to give your child access, to a screen to give yourself some time to breathe or get some much needed rest or just get something essential done, that's okay. Give yourself some grace as a parent. As researchers and clinicians, we're constantly learning more about tech and our understanding is always changing. So as a parent, you can't expect yourself to know all the things, but acknowledge that, you're here right now wanting to learn more. And so it's to kind of shift to that compassionate self in regards to tech use. Really just acknowledging that parenting is hard. Parenting in a pandemic and a digital world is harder. And give yourself some grace. Don't try and acknowledge this without blame or judgment. And maybe you've made mistakes in the past that you'd like to change, and that's okay. Just acknowledge it. And the last part of self-compassion is really just some compassionate actions for yourself as a parent. So whether that just be, talking to other parents who are struggling with managing teens' tech use, or just taking some time to kind of recharge your own battery.
So one thing that we wanted to kind of, a strategy that we wanted to talk about in terms of supporting kids with using tech adaptively is by using it to engage and connect with your kids. There's research to suggest now that screen time has actually become a leading cause of conflict between kids and their families. And we know that familial conflict is linked to this whole kind of other host of negative outcomes like increased anxiety. And lots of times this conflict comes from a disconnect between parents and their teens around the role that tech plays in their lives. Conversely, there's also a lot of research to show that efforts from parents to understand the role that tech plays in their kids' lives and trust that they will behave responsibly online actually has a lot of positive impacts. It's being increasingly shown that kids are actually, in many cases, well aware of the risks online. They, understand kind of how to spot online predators. They know sort of what to do when someone unknown approaches them, things like that. And in this particular study, what they found was that trust between parents and kids, in terms of, trusting them to make their own decisions about how they behave online, actually meant that the kids were more likely to come to their parents for guidance when they encountered risky situations online that they didn't know how to handle. And, partially because they were less fearful in some ways that online access would be revoked or that their parents would be judgmental around whatever activity they were engaging in or what was going on. In this particular study, increased understanding from parents around the role that tech played in their kids' lives also meant that kids were more likely to share and engage with their family members around online content, things that they were accessing, which had this sort of snowball effect of promoting even more family connectedness and support and understanding. So with those kind of research findings in mind, one thing that you can do is try to learn about and participate in your kids' online world a bit more, doing things like expressing interest in what they're doing and reading and watching with sort of a non-judgmental attitude. What are the apps that they're using? How do they work? What do they use them for? What things do they like to look at or learn about? I think that, like Selena said, these things are always changing. Our kids are always on new apps. Things are always looking different. So, if they're using an app like Snapchat, maybe expressing some interest in what that looks like for them, how they use that, what the features are, not with the intent of being judgmental or concerned, but just in terms of understanding how they connect with peers and connect with people in their lives. Also making space for opportunities to be brought together around your child's online world and their interest in tech. So, maybe your teen is doing a TikTok challenge, don't be afraid to participate in that, do it with them. Make your own Snapchat account so that you can kind of understand how Snapchat works, send them some funny Snapchats, understand those features, use a Pinterest board to plan a project together. Maybe you're working on a new room at home or you're planning something for the house. Using a Pinterest board together could be a good idea to engage that way. You can even have your kids teach you something. It can be very empowering for kids to have an opportunity to show their parents how to do something, because so many times parents, are ahead of their teens in so many ways in terms of skill and knowledge. And tech can be one of those domains where kids have a lot of knowledge that they can share with you and teach you, and it can be a valuable opportunity for you to connect and maybe even make your life a little easier in some ways. So the overall message here being, finding ways to engage and connect with your kids around their tech use. And kind of following from that, another way that parents can support adaptive tech use in youth is by fostering the development of good media literacy skills. This is kind of a newer term, digital media literacy, but Media Smarts, which is a Canadian organization, describes it as the ability to critically, effectively, and responsibly access, use, understand, and engage with media of all kinds, which is a big definition, but we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. There's sort of this empowerment protection paradox right now in terms of, how parents are choosing to address their kids, online behavior and online safety. On the one hand, do we decide what kids consume, use the parent controls, restrict their access to certain content, put limits on their screen time, or do we teach them the skills to sort of evaluate and respond on their own and make their own decisions? And what the research is telling us right now is that the prevention approach in terms of, controlling what kids see, using controls, is unlikely to be overly useful, only because it's really hard to control what kids see on the internet. Even if we have the parental controls, the internet is everywhere. It's accessed in all kinds of locations from all kinds of devices. And telling them to do things like just don't do this isn't helpful in telling them what to do. Alongside this, the things that many adults are concerned about, things like online predators, are really quite misaligned with what youth are telling us in terms of the challenges that they face online. They're telling us things like, navigating conflict with peers, online behavior, navigating kind of all the information that they receive from social media influencers. Those are the things that they're struggling with and need support and figuring out how to navigate. So instead of leaning towards more of a, protection lens where we try to prevent youth from being exposed to content that we prefer that they not see, focusing on giving them the tools to safely explore and respond when things go wrong, teaching them to think critically, evaluate the information they receive, and communicate responsibly online. And this, has a whole kind of host of I don't know what to say, like pathways or outcomes, like when your child makes an Instagram post, are they saying what they want to say? How are they saying it? How did their words come across? Are they communicating what they mean to say? Is it kind? Is it appropriate? Do they have the skills to communicate and present themselves online in the way that they would like to? And, vice versa, when they see a post from someone else, do they know how to identify a credible source? Do they know how to seek out needed information? Can they say, who was this media developed for and why? Those are important skills to make sure that when kids sort of come up against these tough situations, that they know how to respond and they know what to do. And this kind of ties into the fact that, what research shows us is that there are really few harms that are unique to the online world, despite what media tells us about the harms of the internet. Most of the risks online are connected to the offline world, and offline harms are still much more prevalent. Things like bullying, sexual violence, victimization. Kids are still much more likely to experience those things offline than they are online. So kids still need to learn these skills, but the good thing is that the skills they learn offline translate to their online behavior and vice versa. So the things that we teach our kids about how to act online, how to address harms, and the skills that we teach them about responding to these harms offline are likely to translate online as well. And we'll share some resources at the end, just around some sites that you can use for activities to support media literacy skills.
So we know from research that time spent online communicating with friends can actually increase the quality of these friendships and enhance their offline relationships. So there's actually a lot of known positive benefits of online social connections when they're used in a way to connect with others. So online opportunities allow teens to connect with communities that appeal to their interests that they might not have been able to access offline. They get exposure to new ideas that they can kind of think critically about, which is obviously linked to the media literacy skills as well. But really, just the online world provides them with a lot of new opportunities. And for some kids who have difficulties communicating in person, it can actually help allow them to communicate the way that they want to, because it gives them more time to think about what they want to say, reflect on their messages, rather than having to respond in the moment, which can be quite hard for some kids. And so, sorry, I forgot to upload the slide. And so when screens begin to replace face-to-face interactions completely, consistently, sometimes it is normal for kids to just sit and text their friends all day and not want to go out with them. But when it's a consistent pattern that you're noticing, this could be a sign that it's more of that problematic screen use that we were talking about. And this could be a sign that it's time to maybe seek help or try some new tech strategies. And it's really important to kind of pay attention to the conflicting messages that teens get about tech use. So, for instance, there's a lot of wellness apps, and kids are often encouraged to use tech in some instances, but not others. So, for example, at school, like tech is quite integrated. Many kids at the high school level, have their own Chromebooks, have their own cell phones, things like that, and they're often used in educational ways. But then there's times at homes when they're told not to use their devices. And this can be really conflicting for kids. Why is tech and screens okay in one setting, but not the other? And there's wellness related apps. We've developed a lot of apps for teens, but again, they're getting sometimes criticized when they're using this tech, and that can be conflicting for kids. And it's really important to kind of pay attention to our own tech use when we're giving, because it sends messages to kids as well. So what are you actually modeling to your kids with your own tech use? And it can be really important just to, reflect on your own social media use and your own tech use. Are we plugged in when we don't need to be? What are we posting online? Are we following social media etiquette? Are we using, the internet as our personal journal? And, do we sleep with our phone next to us? Again, these are all conflicting messages. Many parents do. And then we tell kids that, screens are bad at bedtime. So it's just really important to be clear about what you're modeling and what digital values, behavior, and etiquette you're teaching to your kids. Your kids are watching you, and it can be quite conflicting for them, if they're told that they can't use their screens at the dinner table, but then parents are taking phone calls at the dinner table. This is sending them mixed messages. So just being mindful of what you are modeling to your kids. And when you notice that they're actually following, the behaviors and the etiquette and what you're trying to teach them about media literacy, like make sure that you acknowledge those efforts and praise and reinforce when they're following your expectations for their digital use.
And just to add on to that, I was just going to kind of link back to what we said at the start around different types of tech use. I think that considering the different types of tech use and, what you are and aren't concerned about for your youth, having a really clear idea of what it is that you are versus aren't concerned about can help support more effective conversations with your kids around what you expect versus what you don't. Saying you use your phone too much is very broad and very vague, whereas saying, I can understand why you're on your phone when you are using it for homework and you're watching, a show before you go to bed, but I am concerned about your tech use when we're having dinner at the dinner table and you're texting your friends and it's taking your focus away from, our family time and that conversation. So can we make a plan around how to address that? So having kind of some clear and specific ideas of what it is that you expect and what the messaging is that you're sending around what you're okay with versus what you're not.
Yeah, and just kind of a disclaimer, like conversations about tech use can feel really awkward for both kids and parents. And that's not a sign that you need to just stop and not talk about those things, even if it feels weird and really foreign and you feel out of your element. It's really important to talk about these things with kids and have these really tough conversations to help them start to develop these media literacy skills and use their tech adaptively.
So we've just got about 5 minutes left here, and we want to make sure, I see that there's some questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time for those. We, of course, in this 30-minute presentation have really only scraped the surface of a lot of different topics. So we've included some of our favorite resources here to help you extend your learning on whatever resonated with you today. Like Selena said, there are going to be some things that probably feel irrelevant or not useful for you, and other things that maybe do. So please take what's useful and leave what isn't. Common Sense Media is a great resource just around kind of better understanding for parents of media and tech. Media Smarts is a Canadian organization that has lots of information on media literacy. Healthy Children has some great information around tech and tech guidelines in families. You want to talk about the last two? I think those are.
Yeah, so Break the Fake is it's basically just how to tell like what's real online and what isn't, and to be able to critically think about what we're seeing online and being able to kind of differentiate between, is this actually true, or is this heavily filtered, is this heavily edited, and are people just presenting their best self online. And then there's also a family media plan. So if you feel like you've tried all the strategies and they're not really working, this could be an option. It's just one tool that we wanted to give you. And basically it's a media plan for the whole family, so something that everyone would have to follow, not just the teen or young person in your life. Yeah.
And it has some really good different steps around things you might not have considered, or just guidelines around what types of limits to set, or considering what types of limits you may want to set, or identifying things that you're concerned about. So that was a really great resource. If you prefer to learn offline, we've also included a couple of good books here that you could consider having a look at. So at this point, I think we'll just stop here. We've included this feedback link again for you, but if anyone has questions, we'll take a minute here just to pop through the chat and see if there's anything we can answer.
I don't think there's any questions. We had a comment about somebody who made a rule about picking up their phone at dinner, and the husband had to actually do the dishes. I love that. That's so funny. Yeah, if anyone has questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or just pop any questions in. Can you go back to the last screen with book recommendations? Oh, there we go. There you go.
This behind their screens is a very, very new release within the last half a year or so, and I have read it myself and I found it very useful, so I would recommend that one for sure.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions. Oh. Any suggestions that might assist in getting kids with ADHD to transition from screen time to the next activity?
Ooh, that's a great one. Just in case you didn't hear, it was just a question around transitioning kids with ADHD from screen time to the next activity. And it's not too specific, because I think this is something that families struggle with kids even who don't have ADHD. I think a really useful suggestion around transitions can be having a plan before you go into tech use around, what the expectation is, what the limit is. So instead of saying, why don't you play on your iPad for a little while before dinner, saying, we're going to play on the iPad for 30 minutes before dinner, and then we're going to have dinner at this time. Here's the timer that's set. So that kids kind of have a very clear expectation going in of, what the expectation is going to be. They have perhaps a visual reminder of the time as it's running out, and they know what's going to be expected of them afterwards. So there's no room to say, well, 5 more minutes or this or that or the other thing, that there's kind of a very clear expectation around what the plan is going to be.
Yeah, and I think just generally giving your child time to comply. So if you say like, get off screens right now, that's usually not going to go over very well, ADHD or not. So just, being like, in 15 minutes, I'd like you to get off your screen, and giving them that time to adjust can often lead to better outcomes as well. We got another question about, how does one know if screen time is becoming problematic? So this would be, if you're noticing that screens are starting to interfere with important areas of your child's functioning. So they're not getting their schoolwork done because of screens. They're not interacting with their friends whatsoever outside of screens. They're not participating in family. If they only have, the only pleasure that they're getting in their life is from a screen, then that could be a sign that, it's maybe time to seek some help out, and that this is maybe bordering on the more problematic side. Okay, so we're all out of time. We have one more question. Oh,
Sure,
a
yeah.
couple more questions.
We'll answer that one more question, but just a quick note for anyone who has to leave that we will be recording and we'll send the slides out after the presentation. And this is the last Parent Lunch and Learn of the year, so we appreciate everyone who joined us, and we'll look forward to sessions from next year, sorry. So thanks everyone for joining, and please feel free to leave if you have to go, but we'll just address this last question here.
Yeah, the last question is around would we recommend reading online, like on a screen or a book? Because a parent's worried about eyesight by reading on the screen. And I think any professional you ask is going to have a different opinion on this. I think
I would say
Yeah.
my guidance would be that probably should you be reading on a screen 100% of the time? No, but if your child needs to read as part of their literacy development, and doing that on a screen is a way that is engaging for them and makes it possible for them to learn those skills, then I don't see a problem with that. Of course, there are, I'm not a doctor, so I can't comment on the eye strain physical pieces, and that's certainly something to consider, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with leveraging technology in ways that it can be adaptive. And if helping your child to read and engage with literacy-based materials is a way that you can use technology, then that's fantastic. Like, what a great way to show your child that technology can be used as part of their education and learning.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. I think we're all out of time though. So are you okay?
What's our last?
There's question, there's a few. There's one about, are kids able to track their own screen time? And are they developmentally able to do this? I think a lot of tech has this actually built in already, like iPhones they track screen time as well. But I think if, hopefully if you take anything away from this, I think Laura and I have, our stance is really that it's about how they're using screens more than how much. But at the same time, if that's something that's kind of part of your family media plan, then I think that's, 8 to 12, I think that's
Yeah, and if your
Yeah.
child has an iPhone, the screen time feature is actually quite advanced and useful, and it shows you not only how much screen time that you're using on your phone, but actually which apps that you're using. So that might be a useful way for, you and your teen to talk about tech use, like opening up that screen time app and saying, okay, sure, you spent 8 hours on your phone. What apps were you using? Were you spending 8 hours on YouTube? Were you on messages? Like, what were you doing on there? There's actually a lot of research to suggest that kids overestimate their own screen time. So I would not be surprised if, you ask your child to give an estimate and it's actually quite much higher than the actual estimate on their screen. But the feature is there, and I don't think there's really any age that's too low for kids to start looking at those pieces around how they're using their screens.
Yeah, and it can just be a really good starting place, to explore that with your teen and like, show an interest in how they're using their time online.
Yeah. Maybe we'll take one more question.
Yes, okay, one more is just a question around Chat GPT.
Yes, Chat
in
GPT.
schools, yes, and the challenge of critical thinking is becoming increasingly common. I don't know that there's any formal plans from the board to kind of talk about this, but I think it's an issue that's coming up even at the university level, with kids getting essays off Chat GPT and things like that. So I think you're right. It is becoming increasingly a concern that kids need to, be able to think critically about what they're seeing online and know, when it is appropriate to use and when, it's not for like academic purposes.
I think also this is another great opportunity around ChatGPT to connect and engage with your kiddo. I actually myself recently used ChatGPT for the first time, and I didn't really understand how it worked. So it could be a cool way to sit down with your kid and say, hey, show me how this works. The one thing I will say is that, for all of the media around ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, it's still not a person. So to use it effectively, it can be leveraged as a good tool, and you do still have to be able to think critically in order to use it. It's going to come up with errors, and it's going to come up with irrelevant information. And so, if your child is thinking, I'd like to use ChatGPT as a way to support a project I'm doing, well, why don't you sit down together and figure out, how can we use this as a tool and still find ways to assess the information? Can we check if what ChatGPT is telling us is correct? What sources did they use? It's a good opportunity to work in some media literacy skills and learn a little bit about these apps that your kids are kind of going back and forth with.
I think that was all the questions. Yep, I think we got them all.
Cool, great.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is the last Lunch and Learn of the year, but I just wanted to give a big thank you to any parents who joined us today or for any of the other Lunch and Learns.